Hello, my name is Stephen Richardson and I work for the World Green Building Council, a global network that's catalysing sustainable built environments for everyone everywhere. Many of you know that buildings are responsible for a large amount of carbon emissions. 40% of energy consumption, 36% of emissions globally, and that's just from their use phase, what we often call operational carbon. Buildings also consume half of all material that we extract from the environment, and they're also responsible for a third of the entire waste that's generated within the EU. The emissions associated with producing, constructing and disposing of all of this material is known often as embodied carbon. And a climate neutral Europe cannot be achieved unless we address the total impact of the built environment, tackling both operational and embodied carbon in a whole life cycle approach. And it's so important that buildings receive political attention as both a challenge and an opportunity for climate action. And that's why we're accelerating that action on whole life carbon impacts through our European campaign Building Life. Together with a coalition of 10 national green building councils and a growing group of business and political leaders as our Building Life campaign ambassadors, our message to national governments and to the European Commission is that we must have ambitious policies that address embodied and operational carbon and the environmental impacts across the entire life cycle of buildings. That's why on the 24th of May this year, 2022, we launched an EU policy whole life carbon roadmap. This was developed with the support of a coalition of over 35 leading industry bodies. The roadmap is a bold new policy plan for the European Union to accelerate progress on decarbonising buildings and construction, one of the most heavily emitting sectors in the world. It's the first of its kind at EU scale to address the whole life impact of the built environment across multiple policy routes, and it proposes a timeline of recommendations for EU policymakers to accelerate the decarbonisation of buildings through to 2050, tackling both carbon emissions from operation and these long overlooked emissions from materials and construction. The roadmap's recommendations were developed with input from major business networks, industry associations, as well as environmental NGOs and city networks, and they're divided into 4 key policy routes: building regulations, waste and circularity, sustainable procurement, and sustainable finance. And together these recommendations can help to pave a way for how EU policy can enforce the calculation and reporting, but also the regulation and reduction of emissions across the whole life cycle of buildings. And in parallel, the 10 national green building councils in the project have been developing roadmaps at national level to build political and industry support for action across the region. If we don't address the whole life carbon impact of buildings, these emissions could decimate Europe's remaining carbon budget, putting the EU Green Deal's targets of a climate neutral Europe and the goals agreed by policymakers at COP26 well beyond reach. We must act now. Find out more about the project, about the roadmap, by going to worldgbc.org/building life. Thank you.